All right, welcome everybody to Indigitization. I'm Mimi Lamb, and I think I know everyone in this room already, but I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm the Digital Projects Librarian in Digital Initiatives here at UBC Library, and I'll be co-presenting with Christina Laszlo, who is the archivist at the Audrey and Harry Hawthorne Library and Archives at MOA, and also Jerry Lawson, who's the coordinator for the Oral History Language Lab at MOA, and his digitization technician, Hasalem Rivers. And we'll be talking about Indigitization, which is a collaborative project between the Irving K. Barber Learning Center and the First Nations Technology Council and a number of other partners as well. So I want to thank Sarah for inviting us to speak about this project during Aboriginal on History Month. This collaborative endeavor began in early 2010, so it's actually quite wonderful for us to be able to have some deliverables to share with everyone. And I'll begin. I'll start with some introductory information. As I mentioned, this project originated as a collaborative pilot project between the First Nations Technology Council and the Irving K. Barber Learning Center. And you'll see that it has actually grown to include many other partners and contributors. My involvement began in late 2010 when I was the Community Digitization Librarian at the Irving K. Barber Learning Center. I since then have changed units and positions and now work in the Digital Initiatives unit. However, I was able to continue work on this project because the project partners saw the importance and the value of continuity. Now for a little background to the project and its objectives. As you're probably aware, many First Nations communities have information and resources that need management and preservation. Digitization converts the deteriorating physical items into digital files that can be manipulated, backed up, etc. The title of this project, Indigitization, is a clever combination of the terms Indigenous and digitization. And this project uses an innovative and inclusive method to create information resources for communities. Collaboration. Indigitization involves community partners as well as university partners. The mission of the demonstration project was to clarify processes and identify issues in the digitization and preservation of First Nations community information resources. The main objectives were to support the community partners in developing their processes and policies, and to use this experience to develop a toolkit that can be made available to other First Nations communities. Another characteristic of this project that distinguishes it from other digitization projects is that the participating communities were not required to make their digitized items publicly available online, which can be a barrier for many First Nations communities due to access protocols and culturally sensitive information. Now, before I talk about the toolkit in more detail, I want to take a few moments to identify and acknowledge all the partners on the project. From UBC, the Irving K. Barber Learning Center, the Museum of Anthropology, specifically the Audrey and Harry Hawthorne Library and Archives and the Oral History Language Lab, the School of Library, Archival, and Information Studies iSchool, specifically the First Nations Concentration, and the First Nations House of Learning. Our community partners include the First Nations Technology Council and our 3 First Nations community partners, the Ktunaxa Nation Council, Haltsuk Cultural Education Center, and the Namgis Nation. Now for the toolkit. As I mentioned, since the partner communities were not required to make their digitized objects publicly available, the toolkit is the main deliverable of the project. The intention was to capture and synthesize the experience of the 3 partner communities into a resource that would help other First Nations communities wishing to engage in similar projects. The version in existence at the moment is a draft version because we see the toolkit as a living document that will grow and improve. An electronic version of the toolkit was launched recently at the BCLA conference in May and is available at indigitization.ca. The purpose of the toolkit is to provide a reference document as well as a series of templates and examples for communities interested in undertaking digitization projects. The toolkit is based on the combined experiences of the partner communities and is also informed by industry standards and sound practices in the areas of digitization. By supporting digitization and building capacity in First Nations communities, the toolkit is a stepping stone in safeguarding future generations' access to valuable community information, as well as ensuring the long-term preservation of these resources. I encourage you all to view the toolkit for yourselves and to provide feedback. All the content is hosted on UBC Wiki and fed to a WordPress site that is refreshed every 30 minutes. The WordPress site allows for commenting, which is a valuable feature where users can provide feedback for improvements and addition to the toolkit. The Wiki platform allows for multiple authors, so our collaborating partners can update and improve their respective sections of the toolkit into the future as well. Here you can see a screenshot of the toolkit contents. The highlights include sections covering an overview of digitization, project planning, as well as references to resources on sound practice and metadata. Other significant sections include detailed instructions on specific formats, such as audio digitization, which you'll hear about in more detail from Jerry and Hasalem later on. Since our intention for the toolkit to be an evolving document, future versions will include an expansion of the audio digitization section to include reel-to-reel audio tape digitization and a new section on map digitization as well. Also, I should mention that we are mindful that there are First Nations communities that do not have ready access to the internet, so a limited print run will be distributed to numerous First Nations communities as well. Now, before I pass it over to Christina to talk about audio and other funding issues, I would like to highlight one particular section of the toolkit that is of particular importance for First Nations communities. On campus here at UBC, copyright and intellectual property have become well-known concepts, but understanding these concepts are also essential in establishing a digitization project for a First Nations organization. Section J of the toolkit touches upon these issues, but also offers resources on how to customize access for materials that require complex access protocols, as well as culturally sensitive materials. Two resources that would be of particular interest to First Nations organizations are the Creative Commons and Mukadu's traditional knowledge licenses. Access to copyrighted material and intellectual property of First Nations communities can be regulated through Creative Commons licensing in a number of methods, ranging from highly restrictive, which means all rights are reserved by the copyright holder, to fairly lenient. Mukadu is a community-oriented digital archive and content management platform that takes the unique cultural heritage needs of Indigenous communities as its focus. Traditional knowledge licenses, or TKL, recognize that Indigenous communities have different access and use expectations in regards to their cultural material and traditional cultural expressions. In particular, the TKL are designed to identify and clarify which material has community-specific, gendered, and high-level restrictions. Additionally, these licenses recognize that use of specific materials may require special permission and appropriate acknowledgement of the source community. Resources such as these allow First Nations communities to identify access needs and issues and take steps to create policies to control as well as open access to valuable resources to community members as well as the general public. I do have a kind of side note about a development in the program. We're in talks between First Nations Technology Council and Irving K. Barber Learning Center, as well as MOA, to take the project into the next level, and we're looking at providing training for communities in specifically audio digitization. This is still in the works, and one of our stakeholders is sitting in the audience, Gordon. So, but this is a very exciting development, and in light of a lot of funding crises happening in the cultural heritage sector, it's very hopeful, and I'm going to invite Christina up now to touch upon these issues. Sorry, do you want me to stop?
No. Hello, everyone. So I just wanted to really talk a little bit about the genesis of the MOA portion of this project. Initially, at the archives at the Museum of Anthropology, we have a large collection of open reel audio recordings as well as audio cassette recordings, and they've always been somewhat problematic in terms of access, just because we don't have the equipment to play them back for people, or the expertise prior to Jerry's arrival on the scene to really deal with them appropriately, to make them accessible, to digitize, or to really to do anything with them. So they just sat really in boxes in the archives for years and years. And then I started thinking about how we could make these more accessible and how we could process them. And at the same time that Jerry and another colleague of ours, Ann Stevenson, was talking with the First Nations Technology Council, talking with the Irving K. Barber initiatives. So I started thinking about applying for a grant specifically to digitize the audio recordings that had First Nations content. And these would be field recordings by anthropologists that contained songs and stories in Indigenous languages, and recordings of talks and lectures at the museum by such noted artists as Bill Reed and Robert Davidson, among many, many others. So the original grant was to hire an intern to come in, which is Kasilam, who you'll hear from later today, to set up and to digitize our open reel audio procedures at the same time as Jerry was creating the toolkit for the open reel audio materials. So all of this was working in conjunction and to solve our immediate need, but at the same time, the idea was that this would grow into the toolkit and the equipment going out into those communities, First Nations communities, who could then continue on with this work at the community level. So our part was really just getting our immediate need met in the archives, but also to create this greater infrastructure for community digitization. So the direct benefits to the museum archives was the immediate accessibility of our digitized content to our researchers. But more important, and I think far greater, was that the digitization toolkit for open reel audio recordings and the ability to test processes and procedures at our archival level to really work out the kinks, and then to take that and bring that into the communities was the real benefit of the project. So where did the money come from? Well, we applied for a National Archival Development Program grant for just over $7,000. We provided about $6,000 from the museum in cash and in-kind contributions. About $3,000 worth of equipment for the project was provided by the First Nations Technology Council, and that equipment will travel along with the toolkit to the communities as the communities request the materials. So just as an addendum to that funding, the National Archival Development Program has been cut. So this is where I get on my political soapbox a little bit. So the ability for us to provide the seed and the impetus for projects like this is now unfortunately gone. But while it was there, we've done some really great things with it, and you will hear more about that from Jerry and Kasilam. Thank you.
So I added a slide to the presentation because I'm sort of afraid that I'll miss a few of the points that I really like to hit. That when I first started at the museum, I talked a little bit with my supervisor, Ann Stevenson, who you'll hear a little bit throughout the day, that I can sit in my lab and digitize things all day long and barely make a dent in what has to be done in the province. much less beyond that. So the quantity and location of media, simply talking about First Nations communities and organizations, the media is everywhere. It's in resource centers, libraries, community centers, in people's basements, in attics. Every family has cassette, open reel video, which I never thought I would see coming in communities. The need for digitization is phenomenal. And to a great extent, we have very little understanding of what's on these recorded media objects, simply because they haven't been playable in so long. People have lost their open reel players, they've fallen into disrepair, so few places repair them. So the need, as I said, I can sit in my office digitizing, and we had a small sort of program set up at MOA for me to digitize things for Christina on an access request basis. So I could sit there and digitize things as they were requested, but that wouldn't really help beyond what I do. So capacity building, sort of province-wide, has been set as a mandate of my office. And like I said, I have to give a great deal of credit to my supervisor, because that's not something that's always done. The lack of resources, money, we've talked about that. You're probably all in the library sector, so you're familiar with that problem. The knowledge and experience, the fact that this equipment hasn't been in good repair in 20, 30 years, that there are so few places that repair them, and it's expensive, and so few people know how to use them because there are so few units around. That's certainly an issue that is acknowledged on our part. And misinformation. So there is a certain amount of misinformation regarding what level you need to hit in everything that you can do within an organization. There are best practices established for digitization that are simply unmeetable by pretty much anybody, including large organizations. So to read simply the documentation without some sort of sense that something giving you permission to not meet that stalls a lot of people out. So that's just a few things that I really wanted to hit, and oftentimes I miss through as I breeze through a presentation. So onward. Again, I'm the coordinator for the Oral History and Language Lab at the Museum of Anthropology. The Museum of Anthropology, most of you will know, be familiar with us, best known for the building itself was designed by Arthur Erickson. We have a large number of pieces by Bill Reed and a very large Northwest Coast collection that's extensively researched. 2 years ago, we reopened from a $55 million, about 7-year renewal project that was funded primarily by the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, a number of other sort of matching grants and organizations that allowed us to completely redo our physical spaces, including what was the visible storage became the Multiversity Gallery, where people were, originating communities were contacted and consulted with on how they wanted objects displayed. So this is a physical manifestation of having different ways of knowing the same, of looking at the same object and knowing about the same object. You have a Western way, you have originating community, indigenous ways of knowing, and possibly more. And we've turned into the MOA Center for Cultural Research that is sort of, I'd say a large part of what we do is examine just that. What are those multiple ways of knowing, and how can you get into partnerships to figure that out and to live together and to be respectful in the way you approach and honor things in that way. So my office, the Oral History and Language Lab, is basically like any other sound booth digitization lab, small. Except beside me, you'll see room 213 is a collaborative research room. That's essentially just a classroom that does not have food or drink allowed so that objects can be brought in. People can do object-based consultation, go immediately into a sound booth for high quality, born digital, oral history and linguistics, material culture recordings. And then the community lounge next door is like a large living room that is comfortable and a place that originating communities can have some privacy and either perform ceremonies that are required by, which are required with some object-based visits, or simply the process of recording is very onerous and a place that people can relax. So, so I just covered this. So recording was primarily the impetus for my lab. It was what was thought to be the requirement of having some sort of a digital space within the museum, because we are very object-centered. Very quickly we realized that it takes a lot of money to do object-based visits. You have to bring people from far-reaching communities, put them up in Vancouver, figure out what objects you want to examine, and that's really a very small part of those research projects. So it's the sort of contextualization, figuring out what objects you want to talk about, and there's a lot of work that goes on outside of the recording. The recording takes very little time compared to everything else, all the other resources that go into them. So as the renewal project sort of came to an end, and we realized we really didn't have the bandwidth of recording projects to keep me busy, and I feverishly went out to go and pick up open reel and cassette equipment of my own so that we could bring in digitization as one of the core functions of the lab. That's my background, working with First Nations organizations in media consulting and digitization, and working at a far lower funding level than I'm used to at MOA. And that is rapidly changing as we don't have a ton of money anywhere at the museum, at the university, I should say. So, so how do we become involved in the Indigitization project? I worked with Mimi quite a bit at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs before she came to UBC, and she called me to ask for an informal request for hardware. The Indigitization project was going to buy a little bit of hardware to go into communities at the end of the, well, during or at the end of the project. There was no real context to it. They just knew they needed a little bit of hardware, people needed to digitize, so we'll buy a cassette player and a computer, maybe. So there was no real budget set, there was no, there wasn't really any idea of what that meant in buying hardware. So, Mimi realized this when she called me, that this is a difficult thing to answer. Like, what hardware should I buy when you don't know what when you don't know what your budget is, you don't know what sort of level of skill or maintenance you're going to be able to support, depending upon who's going to be running the project. Or is it going to be Windows or Mac? What is the skill set involved? What desktop, laptop? Everything sort of flows. You have to have something to hang all of that off of. So without anything really defined, it was a really difficult question to ask. And sort of the further we got into it, the more we realized that you really sort of need to plan your digitization program, your step-by-step, before you can really, that sort of feedback affects what hardware you buy. You sort of think about the hardware, you plan out whether or not it meets all your requirements, and then you, if it doesn't at some point, or if there's something that's incompatible, you go back and that affects. So you really sort of had to be something that was fully tested before you can package it up and send it to communities and say, this is what you need. So if we didn't actually put it all together, so I can't just give them a quick hardware list, say that's what you need to digitize, when it hasn't been tested altogether. So we decided to stupidly test it altogether. That was, so incrementally our involvement in the project just sort of kept creeping up based on what was needed, based on not going down another exercise of giving somebody an incomplete solution, something that you think works but hasn't been tested, and then somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing has to test it for you and figure out that it doesn't work. So, so there are a lot of competing solutions. And one of the problems with best practices right now is that there isn't a single new cassette player that meets minimum best practices, as outlined in the IESA best practices, the sort of Bible that most digitization projects use. So what do? There are a lot of used cassette decks that meet that, but how long will they be supported for? How do you get them serviced? How do you make sure that it is actually working to the specifications that it was working when it was new? That sort of realized that in a place of where you have some stable funding like my lab, where I could keep on top of something, I could probably buy something that was used and at that sort of professional level and maintain it. But something that's going out to communities would be much more difficult because you don't know what the sort of project manager is going to, what skill set that person's going to come with. Are they going to come with technical, or are they going to come with more of the project or metadata? You can't dictate that way up front. So what we did was we got the best new unit that we could find that met some sort of rugged standards, and we documented where it didn't meet best practices, but it is probably better than, say, 95% of the original recording units that originally made the recordings that will be digitized. So to hold something that may have been recorded on a $15 cassette recorder to this sort of $1,000 standard is a really difficult thing to support, especially when support and maintenance becomes such an issue going forward. And I did want to say that in researching cassettes, it hasn't been a huge part of my job before this project came along. I sort of went from special project, trying to figure out what our capacities at the lab were and building our capacities and building our capabilities. And cassette went from ubiquitous to obsolete in the shortest period that I've ever seen. MP3 players killed analog completely. So things where you may have had 10 companies 5 or 6 years ago making high quality cassette decks, you have, I think, 3 now, and 2 of them are actually the same company. So you have, I think, TIAC and Tascam are both different divisions of the same company. So you have really gone from what was very everywhere to what is extremely specialized in a short period of time with cassette. So that's something that we're seeing more and more in sort of all digitization efforts. So again, used as out, we went with the Tascam 202 MKV. It's sort of designed for churches and nightclubs that still have cassettes. And it's rugged. It's meant to last. It has amongst the highest technical specifications for playback. And the fact that it's got dual wells means that you can actually exhaust one transport mechanism and then just switch over to the second one. So it has sort of dual the life expectancy that you would find in a single deck or one that combines a tape and a CD or something. Laptop, desktop. There are a few things that affect your choices. One of those things is price. One of those things is sort of supportability long term. We've had a few issues with digitizing to Mac-based, Apple-based disk file formats with the origination date changing as you have a copy process that doesn't exist in the NTFS files format. We chose those slides could probably have been in a different order because we chose the MBox 3 as a digitization unit. It's from Avid, used to be Pro Tool or used to be Digidesign. This is an extremely popular hardware piece. It's used extensively in sort of prosumer and as sort of quick capture in a lot of sound studios. The amount of people that use it is tremendous. It meets all of your sort of best practices, technical specifications, but the support for it is Google. The user base is so large that there aren't a lot of problems that you won't be able to find your answers to. And one of the, to go backwards, the Dell laptop that we spec'd out is on the supported hardware list. So that was a fairly easy choice to make once we had chosen our digitization unit. Other components, sort of mid-range pair of speakers, pair of monitors that respond well over a wide variety of frequencies, so you can hear what you're actually getting, as opposed to most speakers that will really emphasize the bass and high-end to make it sound good for MP3s. This was really something that you do want. I'm not going to say that you absolutely need that, but that is definitely beneficial when you're digitizing to know what you're actually transferring, as opposed to what is sort of made to sound a little bit better by some coloration of the audio. we were lucky in that we were able to find things that were rack mountable and put a little shelf for the analog, for the digitization unit, so that everything could be mounted within a rugged case, which sort of gives you the notion that the unit is, let me see if I have, nope, that's Dustin. It gives you the notion that it's truly portable, that you can pick it up and move it around, but that's not the idea. It's not meant to be truly every day, pick it up, go drop it somewhere else. It's meant so that it's very simple to put together in a community. There are literally 7 wires going out the end at the back of the case that are all labeled. You simply put the components down on your desk, you put the case down beside it, so you have the case, your laptop, 2 speakers, and that's about it. So now you just connect power to everything and a USB cable, and it's put together. Christina has a volunteer archival student who's here from South America, who put it together in about 10 minutes, never having seen it before, and was perfectly confident that she'd done it properly. It really is something that part of it is luck, and part of it, and a lot of it is design. We've designed it to be quite simple and that you can be confident in putting it together. It has a power conditioner because a lot of communities have spotty power, and you want to know that before you turn things on. And as I said, it looks portable, but what it really is simple. So you do want to give it this sort of ergonomic, you want to give it an appropriate place in the community, in the organization, that it has an appropriate workstation to be set up in, that has enough room, and that it will sit there and digitize in that place. You don't want to move it around all the time. That's not the point. But it is, I think we've sort of settled on the manual that we put together, the procedures that we put together to go along with the cassette hardware system, should enable people to run their first digitization project. Cassette is a pretty stable format. It's fairly easy to digitize. So going through the manual, going through the level of detail, people should be able to digitize, say, a 2 to 400 tape object sub-collection, very rapidly get a digital collection that they will have to manage, and they will have to give access where appropriate, and they'll have to answer all the questions surrounding digital media management, that if you don't have a digital collection, you simply are visioning through and pretending you know how to do, or hoping that you can do. But cassette is a really nice, entryway to this digital media management. So we're really thinking of this project as mostly your first digitization project for your community organization, where you will go take this, use the processes, digitize to a very high level your, like I said, 2 to 400 media objects, and then build your sort of processes and procedures and policies around your digital media management with this new collection that you've rapidly built. As well, you can look at the process that we've laid out for you and figure out where that works and doesn't work for you, and go out and buy equipment for your community to digitize the rest of your collection, and beyond that, to digitize things that come from the community. So we're trying to allow this to build centers of excellence, I think, is something that was a term that was brought up in the Indigitization project, that we're really trying to allow this to build capacities, and then the different organizations that get access to this toolkit will be able to act as mentors to nearby communities. And as Mimi said, this has gotten a little bit of momentum in terms of what the spin-off benefits are. And I would like to say that this is probably what started off as an informal access request and sort of incrementally became a larger pain in the butt, and incrementally became a larger project, maybe the most important project that I've ever worked on to date, for sure. It's building capacities where this really isn't that hard to do, but there are so many impediments in the way, from, like I said, the information, the hardware, the digital media management, which is becoming easier in a lot of ways, but is not really, you can't know how to do it until you have a collection that means something to you. You can't do it for practice. The fact that we went through this exercise at MOA has enabled us to develop a set of procedures for digitization that in the past I would have to sit with somebody and train them for quite a while before I was really confident that they could digitize something to a decent level. Because I know how I do it, and I make human decisions in digitization that are sort of different in every media object, just based on my experience. So to teach somebody how to do it, to package that up, is really difficult. So people would come and ask me questions and I would tell them. And so the fact that we've got this set of procedures really enables us to use our volunteers and our interns and our work studies and teach them how to digitize and trust that they can do it at a level that is appropriate. So immediately that gives us capacity that we didn't have before. We've also been approved to purchase equipment to set up a small training center. Just for that, we have work studies and interns coming through all the time from SLACE here. We are expecting to act as a training center for community members that we have relationships and build new relationships with. So we'll be bringing in cassette and open reel equipment that is beyond what I have in my lab, and finding space for it, and using these procedures that we've developed to be able to set up some sort of a training center, allowing people to come in and get practical hands-on experience digitizing audio formats that, again, cassette, quite a few places have it. Open reel, nowhere I know has an ongoing program allowing people hands-on experience in digitizing. And there are so many passionate and intelligent people out there with technical experience who can figure out what to buy and who can figure out how to put together a digitization system, but they really need hands-on experience. So this benefit, this ability to set up a training, an ongoing training program where you can get practical hands-on experience is extremely exciting for us at MOA. And I know, I mean, across our department, we've been excited about it. So now, very quickly, gonna bounce over to the project participants. Again, Ann Stevenson is a MOA information manager and my immediate supervisor, and she has shown a tremendous amount of fortitude in allowing us to incrementally get deeper and deeper into this project and seeing a benefit on the back end that I think a lot of people would not have seen. And she wrote a tremendous amount of the manual in terms of the collections portion. Katie Marshall was a work study from SLACE here. She worked a great deal on helping to write the manual and procedure testing, and so myself and Christina, and then I'll turn it over to Hill Selam, who was the digitization intern. And I wanted to say we were a little bit lax in the open reel system. We had always thought that there would be a community component to hopefully be a community member coming in and learning how to digitize, but we forgot to write it into our job description. And we still got a tremendous amount of both information sciences and community members, and by virtue of his knowledge and talents and amazing interview skills, Hill Selam beat out a lot of people with a tremendous amount of experience who are very interested in digitization. So, so I will, and there is a picture of him in the lab. So there we go.
You'll have to forgive me a little bit. I'm getting over a cold, so I have some issues there, but I'll do my best still. So I'll also introduce myself a little bit. My name is Selam Rivers. I come from the Squamish Nation in North Vancouver, and I worked with MOA for about 4.5–5 months, from about November to March, as Jerry mentioned, as the Indigitization intern. A little bit about my background and how I came into that, or became really interested in this work. I am a language revitalization community member in my community. So I'm involved with language revitalization for the Squamish language, but also getting involved with other languages in BC. And so I come at it from a very specific background that a lot of this work is going to directly impact this other work that I'm really actively involved in. And that I can actually see the benefit with other people that are involved in language revitalization. There's a lot of interest happening within language revitalization in BC and around the world with digital technologies. There's new apps coming out, new websites, new digital technologies that are being used with language revitalization. Just recently, Google announced that they've have a project on language revitalization and endangered languages. But one of the things that I've experienced both through my work with MOA and with this project was the value and the importance of especially reel-to-reel, but also cassette digitization. As a language speaker, I'm not fluent in my language. I've learned it later in life, but I come from a community that the First Peoples Council, in their language report in 2010, listed the Squamish language as the second most endangered language in BC. Our neighbors to the north, my relatives, the Seashelt, are considered the most endangered language in BC. So Squamish has about 5 fluent speakers. Seashelt has 2, I believe. And this is a common case for all of BC. There's only a handful of languages that have more than a few hundred speakers, and the majority of them have only a few dozen speakers, fluent speakers that grew up speaking the language. But there does exist a wealth of cultural content, language content on these classic media, like reel-to-reel technology and cassette technology. And so as a language learner, as a cultural preservation person within my community, as a person that's involved in or interested in revitalizing our culture, this material that's captured on these more classical technologies is highly valuable and important for that work. And it's not coming at it just as a interest-based type of thing. It's a part of our healing in our communities. It's a part of our culture. It's a part of our reclaiming our identity. And this connects to a larger breadth of work that's actually happening in the communities. And I know I have many relatives up and down the coast that we are always constantly searching for information about our ancestry and our culture, stuff that might have been collected by anthropologists or ethnographers, and then now linguists, and just different projects that happened, and some of that happened with reel-to-reel technology. When I was working as an intern, I got to deal with a bit of MOA's collection that Christina helped pick out. And some of it was, when I first came on, some of it was what Jerry and Christina talked to me about, was how some of the content they knew what was on the reel-to-reels. Some of it they didn't know. And I got to look at some of the notes that had been collected so far, and we had one reel that just said Indian, I think it just said Indian languages or Indian speakers, and it didn't have any other content. So I didn't know what language, didn't know where from, didn't know when it was recorded or who recorded or anything like that. And we actually got to listen to it, and it was just language, just people talking in the language. But that there's information on there that can now be accessible through this digital technology. And so that's what really excited me and really drove me to be passionate. When I seen the call out for this internship, I was actually kind of laughing. My friend that sent it to me, because this is exactly connected to the type of work I'm already doing, but it's also something that I can really benefit from. I had some experience in digitization around cassette, but only through my own kind of initiative and through my own self-learning. I never had any formal training or anything like that. But so part of working on the manual was actually being trained in digitization with the reel technology. I never actually physically touched or dealt with the machinery or the equipment before, but now I got a chance to do it. And I've heard about it, and I knew people who had dealt with it. And with Jerry's amazing knowledge and experience, I was able to have hands-on experience learning about reel-to-reel technology and how to use it. And Jerry is correct that it is very simple to use. There's a lot of variables that happen when you're using it with the collections that you have and the material that you have, the type of reels and what's on it, what's the condition, all that kind of stuff. But it is pretty simple. Once you are able to have that experience, it's pretty simple to understand what kind of choices you're going to make and what kind of decisions you'll make at what stage and all that kind of stuff. The other part of it for me was coming into an institution like MOA that has in my opinion, a very good reputation with both community collaborations on projects, working with communities, and the collections that MOA has, and coming at it with that strong relationship. So I knew that MOA had already been existing in that kind of sphere working with the communities. And so I came in it with a lot of respect for MOA and for what it has been done and what it has shown to have done in First Nations communities. But also the level of quality that exists from an archival standpoint, I found really valuable in learning, which we might not get if MOA wasn't involved or this type of archivist type of background was involved in this project. And so it sets that standard going forward for First Nations as we get into doing digitization projects, as we start planning and possibly using the kit and bringing it out to communities and having communities test it out themselves or do a small digitization project to eventually possibly do a large digitization project. So one example that that comes to mind for me was I had a friend of mine who his grandfather back in the 60s had recorded his father with the reel-to-reel technology. He had bought the machines, he had bought the tapes, and he had just on his own found it really interesting, the technology at the time. It was a new technology, and used it to record his father, who grew up in a longhouse, who spoke the language, who sang the traditional songs, who knew the place names, knew the oral history, and some of his uncles and aunties and some of the other community leaders and elders at the time. And so in the 1960s, he was able to record these elders that existed at the time. These are what we would consider like our elders' elders. Like I have my elders in my community now. These were their elders at the time. And one of the really interesting things about this is that you have people that were born in the 1800s telling their stories and history from when they were younger. And they probably learned these from people who were born in the 1700s. And so this content, this culturally relevant content is so important because it comes from a time period that is so recent for us and so valuable for us. You have stories that are directly connected to that time period before contact or when contact was originally happening. So there's lots of value that can easily be found in this work. And so there was a specific material that my relative's family wanted to find, and they knew it was on one of these tapes, but they didn't know specifically what tape or what was completely on it. And so there was songs, there was stories, there was language, there was some of it was that he had just recorded a dinner conversation with his kids, and they were just having dinner, but they didn't know that was on there. And so all this kind of material became very valuable for that family, and now it can be valuable for the community. For me as a language speaker, I get to hear a language speaker, an elder, speak the language and possibly learn new words and new phrases and new things. A big part of it for me isn't so much the words and phrases, it's the song of the language. I come from a community, like I said, where I only have about 5 fluent speakers. So my access to a fluent speaker is really limited. And this is, like I said, common for a lot of First Nations. But to have a chance to listen to a fluent speaker who was born in the 1800s speak the language, I can hear the cadence of the language. I can hear the accent that should exist. We're often told as younger language speakers that we have a very English accent in the way that we speak the language. Nith ans chalsilam kuyan kushamen tenachim la chomalchisten ochomel ants schotmish os nes elksen quisnas Iwan hatsen squalowins quint quachnomi. That's a little bit of my language, but I was able to learn from studying language speakers on what the language should actually sound like. So it doesn't have that English accent, has a more Squamish accent. And a lot of this is really valuable for me as a language speaker. And so I can speak to it as a very personal level, how important it was for me to hear these things and to experience these things and to find these things when they don't exist in my community anymore. This was a way to preserve that, and thankfully due to the foresight of some of our elders back then that said this is important, it needs to be recorded, younger generations are going to find value in this at some point, and it has to be preserved, and that exists everywhere in BC. This was just one family's private collection. It was kept in their basement for generations, since the 60s, since it was recorded. And there's lots of families, lots of communities that have stories like this. Some of it, like Jerry mentioned, is just family's own private collection. Some of it's in band council or band offices, community centers, all these types of places where hundreds of these reels exists, and it's still, we're going to find out, hopefully, what's on them and what can be taken from them in terms of helping our communities reclaim a lot of our culture, language, identity, these things that are all connected to it. And so I learned a lot working for MOA and being a part of this project. And I was very grateful for the experience because it was really valuable for me. But I also see and really believe in the potential that this is leading to and the value that it's going to have for Indigenous communities. And so I just want to say thank you all for being here, and thank you for inviting me to speak again.
Thank you very much to our wonderful speakers. I'd like to open the floor for any questions. Eleanor?
Cassettes and reel-to-reel, particularly when people were doing them in their own home, never really started out as the best quality. So is there an issue of transferring it to digital that at best you're maintaining quality, but are you maintaining quality? Or is there even any thought of, I don't want to call it post-production, but improving the quality so that when digital technology becomes obsolete, we're not continuing to lose quality for these recordings?
There's definitely, that's one of the benefits of digitization, is that you can, in many cases, over and over again, I would say I have some skill at things like noise reduction and in playing with different frequencies that exist on a tape, things like frequencies that exist outside of the human vocal range. You can get rid of noise that exists and have a clearer idea of what the original audio signal should have sounded like. And you can do that over and over again by simply working on a copy and then throwing it away if you screw up. And as long as you keep a preservation master, as long as you're never in danger of damaging that original, and that is sort of the first thing that we obviously impress on people. But absolutely, there is digital manipulation after the fact that can help in many cases. There's generational loss in sort of every time you do a transfer, and people have been transferring things from, say, open reel to cassette, and from say open reel video to VHS or beta to or U-matic to some other format that's newer and will last longer. So it just isn't how much care you take in sort of reducing that generational loss. And you can't get around the fact that there will be one more generation. You have to go from analog to digital. So just sort of do it to the best of your ability and keep that original preservation master safe. And in working on access masters, you can really do a lot depending upon what a person wants. You can do some really quick and dirty level changes to make it more listenable than it was in the first place, and so that researchers can listen to it for content. Or if you're doing language work, you can do some noise reduction, but oftentimes I think you'll need someone who does language work to know when you're going too far with it, because whenever you remove noise, you remove part of your original signal. And what happens is a lot of First Nations languages have very sort of soft, whispery sounds that are very important. So how much of it you do really depends on how deft your touch is, and people in the future will have better tools than we have. So the fact is, if we get a good digital preservation copy, then somebody in the future will probably be able to do a better job than we can with far less effort. So absolutely, that is one of the absolute side benefits of having a digital copy.
And so. Then the toolkit presumably has balanced as best as possible the ease of use and the fidelity of the copy for non-technical people to make.
Right. What we've done is really concentrated on the preservation master, on digitizing for preservation. And then we have some very, very simple procedures, steps in place for making an access master, but they really don't go very far, because the order that you do processes in affects how the fidelity of how it carries through. So it's a little bit too difficult. I think if you consider digitization the first step in becoming more versed in digital media, then someone who does your digitization will likely take an interest and learn a little bit about audio manipulation and how to make those. So it's about building that skill set incrementally. It's really, I think it's outside the scope to pretend that we can teach somebody to do those sort of processes in their first project. But, you know, in the second project or third project, and oftentimes it's not a part of the digitization process. That's one of the things that I think I would like to say is that you don't have to have the access. When you have a digital media collection, someone has to manage it. Somebody has to figure out who can access it, how they can access it, how long, like, do you have the right to remix it or to do something else with it? And culturally speaking, that becomes very difficult in communities. So this is something where a lot of times we're pushing people to really pick their 200 or 400 cassettes very carefully so that they can have things that have easy access, that they know what the access is, that hopefully they were recorded for accessibility and they won't have any access constraints. But if they do have access constraints and they're very well defined, then that's something you have to learn to manage too. So, but the processing on the back end is going to be different if you're, say, going to put it into a language application for use on an iPhone than if you were going to be sitting at a listening workstation than if you were going to be doing land claims research. So that's one of the things that people are going to have to learn how to manage, is how to manage your access copies based on your delivery, like what it's for. So those things aren't really within the scope of our project, but we really are focusing on preservation, hoping that people will take that up, and then the passionate people in the community will apply for jobs in order to help make those other things happen. So. I mean, honestly, Hill Salem would probably be far more, I'm really mostly about preservation, and I will help, like I can do things like noise reduction and some of the other processing, but Hill Salem has worked with language apps and like is in the community trying to get some of this, like recording new things. So maybe you could speak a little bit to what the uses are and what sort of processing is what you see in communities following a project.
I think Jerry hit on the spot about some of the language stuff. There's sounds or letters in our alphabet that if you reduce it certain ways, you might lose some of that content. Some of it is like with the songs, even there's things that they're doing in their song. Like one thing that we learned, we were listening to the songs that were recorded, and we realized how much our singing, like we sing our traditional songs, how much our singing now is at such a low caliber compared to how they were singing. Like they were just phenomenal singers, and they were all in their 60s and 70s when they were singing, and they had been singing their whole lives, and they were taught specifically how to sing these traditional songs. And we started to learn that they're doing these things that we don't do anymore, or they're singing like this that we don't do like this anymore, or we've changed it this way when we used to sing it like this. And some of that you can clear up, and it'd be really valuable to be able to hear it a bit more clear, or to understand it a bit clearer. But it also is like super valuable and to do that.
Kristen, I have a question for you. Is there a ballpark figure that you might be able to fill out for us on how much in the digitization toolkit might cost communities thinking that this might be something they're interested in doing in the future?
I have no idea what the ultimate cost is, but I don't think the idea is for them to recreate that. I think this toolkit is available for use within communities, and perhaps Jerry or me could speak to that.
We don't have a defined cost for how much a project or startup project would be. I don't know if Jerry wants to add to that. Or I mean, it's about building capacity. The project's about building capacity within the community, and yeah, there's an initial investment, but the idea is to build on that and really attach a value to.
I mean, I know how much the project at MOA cost, but that was an internship for 4.5, 5 months, setting up all the equipment, Jerry and I's time, in-kind contributions, and all of that put together came to, I think, about $15,000. But that's not really a valuable model in terms of taking what we did at the museum into a community situation. So how much it would cost, I guess, depends on available labor, how much you pay that labor, who's doing the work, equipment transport, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Again, Hilsium could probably tell me what people are paid in communities versus what you're paid at UBC. It's different, I'll say. But the whole point of this project and what every one of us has kept in mind is to make it reusable, is to make it so that people don't have to put the same sort of effort into the next project. So the equipment goes out into communities. So now you're just defining what your management costs are, which are already part of your core, because it's going to be somebody who's making way too little and doing way too much like everybody else, managing a project, and then you just have to hire somebody for digitization, and I mean, there will be, I think, what we've been looking at is sort of storage, which is really tiny compared to what it used to be, like literally a couple $100 for, like, I think 200 tapes would probably fit on a single hard drive now, but you want at least 2 hard drives to go different places. And one part of the manual is we've sort of hit different technology levels. So if you have an IT department, you can figure out how to back it up. If you don't, then we're just specifying 2 hard drives kept in different locations, and then check some corruption checking every now and then. So just keeping it simple for people. But we really made it as reusable as possible. So the idea is that you don't have to go through the same sort of level of effort that we did in order to start a similar project. And that's another part of documenting it, is that when we've tried to put together digitization projects in the past, the documents have always been either 80 pages or 1 page, and you sort of try to synthesize something in the middle. So we've tried to hit a balance of those things that is accessible to people and that allow people to say, okay, I can do that, I'll have to put that off, or I need training for this, and really figure out how it is, like, get a pretty concrete set of steps that they need to take to get to the next digitization, or to get to their digitization project, even if they're not plugging themselves right into this particular set of hardware. So that has always been, like, if you took anything out of my diatribe about how difficult it is to put together a hardware list, I mean, hopefully people can pick a couple parts of the hardware, let that be the thing it hangs off of, and then pick some other hardware to go along with it. So again, like, we're trying to make everything as reusable as we can.
And I think in choosing the software too, we're mindful of choosing open source options so that you don't have that added cost of buying another software suite.
Right, we used Audacity for the cassette capture specifically to make it useful to people who don't have access to this hardware. So they definitely have access to the software, then they can buy the components and then plug in most of the tool, like most of the procedures into whatever system they are putting together. So.
Does that answer your question, Sarah?
Are there any other questions from the audience?
So for those audience members who wish to view the webcast, it will be available at webcasts.barberroomcenter.library.ubc.ca. Thank you very much for attending this presentation. And this is the final program for the Aboriginal on History Month series. And we invite you to check out what did happen at library.ubc.ca. Thank you very much.